Okay. So my first question is, can you tell me more about, actually, I'm going to go to this one. So, so you're a culturally informed therapist. And so how do you think working with a client whose parents are immigrants differs from working with a client whose parents are born and raised in the United States?
Great question. I will say that taking a culturally informed approach, so taking a culturally informed approach and being conscious of the ways that culture impacts us, it's an inclusive approach that's going to help and be really beneficial to everyone. Everyone has a cultural background. Everyone could benefit from thinking about how the layers and layers of their culture impact their mental health. But there are some specific challenges that I think children of immigrants face that maybe somebody whose parents were born here don't face. And maybe that has to do with the immigration story and the way that that impacted their family and what they were coming from and what their process of getting acclimated here looked like, and whether they had community, whether their parents had to leave everything financially and start over. There's a disruption of sorts to the trajectory that would be different than someone whose family's been here for generations and has never had that kind of disruption before. And so there are a multitude of practical pieces related to the migration, to afterwards, to how that impacts how they grow up. And then additionally, there's this bicultural experience. And by that, I don't mean somebody that is coming from mixed heritage. I mean somebody who ethnically and, because of immigration, connects to another homeland and then has this other experience here in either America, Australia, Canada, I mean, any of the Western countries, really any country in general, but the Western countries in particular, there's going to be a bicultural experience of feeling like they're straddling two different worlds because the norms and the culture and the values of their homeland and their parents homeland is going to differ than the rules and the norms and the systems and the way they have to play by the rules here. And so feeling like you're straddling two different worlds with two different codes is going to feel very different than somebody who has always been brought up here, whose parents don't really have a connection anywhere else, and who really doesn't even think of this as its own unique system, just kind of sees this as like the way it is, rather than people who have maybe even experienced themselves a completely different way of being and operating. And then lastly, I will say there's the piece of the intergenerational trauma that I think is not unique to the children of immigrants. Everybody is holding pain that hasn't been processed, resolved from previous generations, but sometimes that's more intensified by what we call like diasporic guilt or diasporic grief, which is really being a child of diaspora when your family moves away from its homeland and then being connected to the news of what's going on in that homeland and holding that kind of experience of both feeling torn, feeling pain for something that's happening someplace else, maybe feeling a sense of survivor's guilt because now you're maybe experiencing some kind of safety that your family didn't. There's also feeling connected to a place that isn't here, so you're never fully there, and then you're never fully here. So you're, again, the straddling of various cultural worlds is really impactful. So there are these practical pieces and ways in which immigration in particular and your culture, acculturation, and the aftermath of immigration impacted your family, impacted your experience. That's different, as well as some of the challenges that you're holding emotionally speaking. That's a really big challenge, as well as the quest for a sense of understanding yourself and belonging. So there are all those pieces that feel really different than somebody whose experience was kind of here for wherever here is for a very long period of time and doesn't feel those pulls or those unique challenges.
Interesting. I love that. Um, yeah, super. I don't know. I'm really drawn to your work because it feels, well, I'm gonna go to this other question I have, which is I really enjoy the mental health world, but then when it comes to like this aspect, it's really lacking. And I have like so many of my questions are centered around this like um gap between what like quote should be in the mental health space and then what it's like, well, what if you're from a collectivist culture that values family over everything else? And so um in one of your videos on Instagram, you talk about the difference between like a traditional therapist and a culturally sensitive therapist. So I think in this video in particular, it was like this person is queer and they're kind of deciding, do I want to come out to my family? Do I want to like, express to them like my authenticity? And I think in the traditional view, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the client went to the therapist, expresses this desire, and the therapist's like, oh my gosh, yes, live your truth, da da da, like you gotta like be authentic, and pushing them towards coming out because they want them to be in line with who they feel that they are, which I understand. And then with the culturally sensitive therapist, it was more almost like more nuanced where this therapist was, instead of pushing them towards coming out, exploring the nuances of the culture and the potential drawbacks and like how it would land. And I'm just, can you tell me more about this kind of scenario, whether it's regarding sexuality or anything else?
Yeah, I think, again, just like the first question, when we take culture into account, it's going to be better therapy for everybody. There are many more nuances than we're used to seeing. And we are so used to, especially in the West, and yeah, with Western hegemony, I will say, which is like West is best, that we're so used to not actually having to identify the values or biases or viewpoint, because the viewpoint is synonymous with the Western viewpoint. The standard is synonymous with Western standard. So we never have to actually say Western, which is why I'm very explicit in saying Western therapy, which already shows you there are other kinds of approaches. There are other ways of looking at this. So it's really critical for us to think about there is no one objective truth. There are subjective experiences, and everything is informed by something. And when you take that into account, culturally speaking, then you bring nuance into everything. You look at there being no one way of being, no one way of being healthy, no one way of being connected, no one way of whatever it is, fill in the blank. So a culturally informed perspective is going to bring nuance, is going to look at things from a much more holistic view, is going to look at things as much more flexible than a certain singular approach that assigns a certain meaning to a certain behavior based on a certain norm. And if you're anything outside of that, then you're labeled as less than, dysfunctional, abnormal, clinical, diagnostic, all of those pieces. And so I'm really wanting to make clear that this kind of approach is useful for everybody to really be able to look at what are the unspoken norms that are embedded in this way of thinking, and is there another way of looking at it? Does this meaning, does this conceptualization fit for this person? And so particularly in the coming out video, it was like, do you have to make such a statement? One might even say, for somebody who's white, not a child of immigrants, that for them even coming out would be, wait a second, why are we coming out? When coming out for what? Why do I have to declare myself as if the standard or the norm is a heterosexual person? So even if you take just the cultural piece of sexual orientation, you might say, no, I don't have to kind of state that I am different from what am I different from? What am I coming out at? Oh, wait a second. We're assuming a heterosexual norm, that's what's normal. So if I'm not that way, then the onus of responsibility is on me to then declare myself different, to then make this revelation. And it's framed as I'm being authentic or living my truth. Whereas how many heterosexual people just live and exist in the world? And what if I wanted to just live and exist in the world as a queer person? And what if my gender identity, my sexual orientation how about that was changing over my life? Am I declaring it every moment? Am I constantly making that declaration? Is verbal declaration the only way to be authentic? Says who? In what cultural context? Who defines that? How did that come to be the norm? Like, these are the kinds of questions one might ask, regardless of what the specific scenario is. I have a lot of videos on my page about culturally informed versus uninformed, but it's taking a more critical viewpoint and asking some of those questions that sometimes, because it's so common, we just assume. And then when you start asking these questions, then you start looking at, wait a second, this is a particular viewpoint. And that means there are other viewpoints. Can we look at this a different way? And for some people, they'll, comment and be like, but that approach does work for me. I do think that that was living my truth. And I'm like, you are actually proving what I'm saying more than countering what I am saying. We need more flexibility. We need more ways to see it. We need to realize there needs to be more nuance in general, rather than this very static way of saying this is health, this is unhealth, this is the way to frame your behaviors, and there's no other way to look at it. It's just bringing in more diversity, because we need more diversity when you're working with something as diverse as people.
Yeah, and before we move forward too, because all my next questions really center around this, like the comparing basically someone who comes from, like you said, the West is super individualistic, and we have collectivist cultures, and then we have this clash that I'm seeing right now on social media between, and I mean, it's been longer than social media, but particularly around the conversation around boundaries of like cut people off, da 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 da. And it's like if you come from a collectivist culture, that is like dying, basically. And so I'm just curious, can you like speak more on the difference if someone's not familiar with individualism and collectivism? Can you speak on that difference? And then can you also tell me about like what do boundaries look like in like an individualistic culture and a collectivist culture and a collectivist family, or from a family from a collectivist culture living in a Western society? Like that is like, I'm very curious about that.
Yes. So, in an individualistic culture, the self is prioritized over everything else. And so, independence and having individualistic autonomy is deemed as that kind of highest level of success and health. And so, in that context, boundaries are actually really, really essential to demarcate self away from others and away from others. Additionally, in individualistic cultures, standing out, being different, being successful as an individual and being special in who you are as an individual is really prized. Whereas in a collectivistic background, the community is prioritized over the self. So you're looking at things like harmony being really important, social bonds really being important. You're looking at ways in which being like your community is valued rather than different from your community or somehow praised for your individuality. You might be praised for ways in which that individuality is put second to the needs of the community or staying within the fold. And so these are extremes, you might think. And the beauty of working with children of immigrants is that I try and get them to use everything within the middle of this continuum, that all of that is available to you. And two children of immigrants could be at very different points in this individualistic, collectivistic continuum. And none of those are right or wrong. They just are different viewpoints of what you prioritize and what's important to you. And as children of immigrants, many of us get pulled by these poles because we're getting such different clashing information. So regarding boundaries, in individualism, you're getting the sense that boundaries are critical. You have to really, again, demarcate self away from others. You need protection from others. You are the most important. And so you have to cut off anything that doesn't protect you and protect your peace and make it okay for you, because you surviving and thriving is above all else. And so if social bonds, were sacrificed, that might be okay in the quest to be comfortable and to be okay. Now, the thing is, I'll just say this, is that it's not just individualism and collectivism. We're not talking about it in a pure sense, because you also got things like white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism and all these other systems that also intermix with these things. And so it's hard sometimes to pull out some of these things because they're happening in the real world with a lot of these other forces influencing what's going on. And so I'll just put that out there. That's a entirely separate question in and
Not
of
like
itself.
happening in a vacuum.
Exactly. And so you can't just say it's just individualism, because individualism is also tied up with capitalism and profit over everything else. And so if you have to lose some people, but you get financially successful, that would be okay. But that's also a capitalistic thing, not just an individualistic thing. So then you've got the individualism and the capitalism. And then maybe you've got white supremacy, where your right to comfort and defensiveness and those things are also mixed in. So then you've got a concoction of all of these things together, that it's not just pure individualism, it's individualism mired with all these other elements as well. And so then it becomes kind of complicated, but let's stay with the individualism and collectivism piece. So in this setup, boundaries are really essential, because you have to say, this is where I am, that's where you are. And there needs to be some distance, because I have got to prioritize my well-being above all else. My success is the most important thing here. Whereas in collectivism, you just don't have as much of a focus on boundaries, because it's not me and you, it's us. And so we're not that interested in, or we're not that focused on, where do I end and where do you begin? It's like, we're us. And today, maybe I'm doing more of the work. And then tomorrow, when I'm sick, you'll do more of the work. And right now, I'm doing this role. And then tomorrow, you'll do that role. It's not that we're not, it's not even that we're not boundaried. It's that we're not needing to think about boundaries as much as we're thinking about what our commitments to each other are, what our obligations to each other are, what is that glue that is connecting us in this collectivistic, community oriented thing. Because I don't see a way to totally succeed if you don't and we don't succeed. So I want, just to begin, it's not just tips and tricks, and I have a whole course on this, and I begin by just saying, this is the framework we have to think about. Because if you don't back up and look at the framework, you're doing all these tips and tricks and techniques and scripts on boundaries, but you're not actually thinking about how boundaries themselves are very different in these two different contexts. One, it's essential, it's necessary, it's paramount to survival. And in the other, you're not thinking as much about that. You're more thinking commitments and obligations. So somebody that, like me, born in another country, moved here young, is straddling these two different worlds, it becomes really difficult to try and find a roadmap for how do you navigate, as a child of immigrants, between these various cultures. How do you navigate something as complex as boundary setting? And so first and foremost, I think you need to, just like I said before, you need to identify where you are in this continuum. Because if you feel yourself much more in a collectivistic background, boundary setting is not going to be as essential as maybe thinking about, or I won't say as essential, but boundary setting might be more relevant to thinking about where in the obligations and commitments there are limits, where you are going to be able to show up and where you want that glue to be between you and another. Whereas if you fall much more on an individualistic side, then there might be much more of a desire to set boundaries in firmer ways. And so you have to think about the framework first and foremost to then even begin the conversation around boundaries, rather than the way that we get it in the West is very much like, everybody should be thinking about this. This is essential for everybody, and it's essential to kind of set them and think about them in the exact same way. But we're not thinking about them in that exact same way. The context is very, very different. So then as we navigate where we are, then we figure out, okay, what are those tools? And most of the children of immigrants that I work with will find themselves somewhat in the middle-ish of these two poles. And you can think of it like a bell curve, it's like 90 something percent fall, like somewhere in the middle, where preserving your personal energy and time and finances and doing what you need for your mental health is important to sustaining yourself. And you want to connect, make those commitments, and be embedded in a community oriented place, because just individual success is not going to feel enough. So dissolving the community for the self doesn't feel good, and dissolving the self for the community doesn't also feel good. So most of my work has been helping people navigate, is there a way to be in the middle of this? What are the tools that might work in one context that might not work in another? And just basically, I will just say, in an individualistic context, additionally within white culture, and you might actually say that white culture is white supremacy culture, but in white culture, you have much more what is direct, what is firm, what is verbalized being prioritized, whereas boundary setting in collectivistic cultures might look like what is indirect, what is subtle, what is kind, what preserves those bonds, doing it from like either a front door strategy or like a side door strategy. And so that's just the basic, I'd say, differences when we talk about the particular techniques, strategies, even scripts is kind of misleading because you might not be saying anything at all. Someone might ask you something, you just kind of shake your head and you do a little shimmy. That is saying no, or I don't want to talk about it. And you didn't verbalize
Right.
anything. So I always laugh a little bit like boundary script. Like I'm not going to be like grandma in another language also. Like I don't even know all these words and my grandma's dead, but I'm just using this as an example of like, grandma, that was not appropriate for me. And I need you to talk about, like, I wouldn't even know how to say that to a grandma. So like, it's not just the script,
Yeah.
it's the fact that a lot of us don't use verbal language to communicate a lot of different things. So long way of thinking about it, but the framework matters, figuring out where you are matters, and then realizing, oh, wait a second, the framework is actually dictating what we're told a boundary and how to set it is. Now we get a lot more expansive in terms of getting creative to think about how to actually enforce them with our values, as well as to be effective in the context that you're trying to set this in.
So is that when you say nonverbal and verbal, are you referring to low context and high context?
So verbal and nonverbal is speaking it versus using your body, and nonverbal ways, non-spoken ways of communicating, because communication can be verbal or nonverbal. I can say yes, or I can just nod
Mhm.
my head. Both of those are yes, but they're different. High context and low context culture is that in a low context culture, which white culture is low context, the context doesn't matter as much as what I am saying. It's listening to the words that are coming out of my mouth, not the way that I am saying it, but exactly what I am saying. The script is
Yeah.
so interesting, but even in a script, you can have shake your head, go off stage, do all of that's also a script. And so a high context culture, the context matters a lot. You might say, like, we'll see, but you're kind of shaking your head. You might laugh, and that kind of means, no, we're not going more forward, or I'm a little embarrassed, or I'm not wanting to have this discussion, or taking a detour from this discussion and moving to another topic. All of that got communicated in my laughter. And in collectivistic cultures, where again, social bonds and harmony are prioritized, it's less I have to communicate with you, and it's
Mhm.
much more saving face, maybe harmonizing. We're finding other ways to communicate that don't embarrass, that allow us both to leave with dignity intact,
Mhm.
that preserve, again, for better or worse, hierarchical structures. And so maybe me saying that to a grandparent, now you're talking about elders. And so you got, in a high context culture, all these other subtle contextual cues, including
Mhm.
your nonverbals, to communicate something that needs to be communicated. So that's the nonverbal and verbal are part of the high
Low
context, low
context.
context piece. Yeah.
Love. I'm like so into this. So this, what I'm about to say, I promise it leads to a question.
Okay.
But
I'm with you.
um, so my background in school, I think I shared this with you, but I studied international business. So I studied like so much culture studies, and I'm just fascinated by all of this. And I was just starting to get into my studies when I was dating this Ecuadorian guy, and I lived there for about 3 months. And seeing the like obviously reading about collectivism in a book is one thing to understand it cognitively, but going there and actually seeing the deep support and like I can't even almost articulate it, but it's just like a system. Like he existed for me. I had also just gone off to college. which is so normal here. You like don't even think about it. You like go across the country. I went across the state. He was like, "How can you be so far from your family? Like, do you not like them?" And I was like, "What are you talking about? Like, this is just what we do." He would drive 3 hours back to his hometown every weekend to see his family. He existed within this complex system of support. It was financial support, it was emotional support. He never was worried about, oh, I have to really make money so I don't end up homeless. Like that was never, he was so supported in this structure. And I think seeing that like really changed my brain chemistry on like what how essential a system is when you grow up in a collectivist culture and how beautiful it really is. I mean, there's drawbacks to everything. Like you said, better or worse, it's all just different. But this brings me to this question of like when we're talking about boundaries and also cutting people off potentially, like there is so much to lose for someone who's existing in that support system. So yeah, I'm just curious if you could speak on that, like the security, the financial support, like being ostracized, like what is there to lose? Obviously, cutting someone off's quite extreme, but even on like boundaries, like you said, like grandma, you can't say that to me. Like that could cause like major disruption. So I'm just curious if you could speak on that.
Yeah, I think that where I see a lot of therapists particularly doing a disservice to their clients is when you don't understand that context and you're operating from individual to individual, you might actually either subtly or not so subtly encourage someone to cut someone off, and you're thinking they're cutting off one person versus, like you said, they're cutting off an entry point into an entire system. And when you don't allow your client to see that, I've helped children of immigrants cut somebody off in their family, somebody that was harmful to them, somebody that no matter how many distancing techniques and other things that we would use, nothing worked. And this person was just not someone that they could have in their lives in any way. But I prepared them for what they might lose and how we might have to strategically work to gain that, whether it was access to the community in some other way or whether it was creation of a new community of support like you're talking about before that change happened so that they could sustain themselves, so that the loss was not so big and blunt. It was something we could kind of slowly move toward because they've created maybe another system of networks because they're going to lose many of their aunts and uncles if they let go of that one aunt. So it's disservice that's being done is not recognizing the systems in which people are embedded and really just looking at them as individuals. Now, I think even more so, children of immigrants who decide that that's the route they've got to go, they just deserve to have all of the tools and to be able to support themselves and to know how to navigate the loss of it's never going to just be one person. It will be lost to some of the larger community, or it will be a reshuffling of what that community looks like. And helping somebody to be able to prepare for that and navigate that is the best. You're never going to be deciding for the person, but you can help them by allowing them to see all of those nuances. And sometimes if you're operating from purely individualistic place, we're trained this way. We learn Western therapy, we learn Western origins, we learn Western norms. The DSM is, our manual for diagnosing people is all based in Western ideas. And then if you also don't have lived experience, then you've got that double you know, yeah, that double gap in terms of like your training, plus you've never lived it, and you don't have that to support clients who are navigating a very different context embedded in layers and layers of systems that maybe you don't ever even think about because that's not the way you live your life. That's not the way you make your decisions. So around boundary setting, I think it's critical to think about like costs and benefits, to think about ways to is there a way to have both? Can you preserve your mental health and honor your culture? Can you stay connected to the fold and stay connected to yourself? These become kind of not either or questions, but both and questions. Can I both do what I need for my mental health and be there for my community and embedded in this layers and layers of systems. Now we're starting to think of more creative solutions. And so I take more of a creative approach to boundary setting. It's like, what are some of those ways you might use the subtleties? What are the ways you can use some of your cultural norms and flip them on their head? What are the ways you can bring in some things from Western culture that appeal to you and that might be effective in this setup? So let's just get creative here, because we do have to walk in knowing what are some of the real costs to this way of being, and are you prepared for them, and how can I as a person help prepare you for that, so that you're not doing one thing for your mental health but then having all of these blowback from that same
Consequences.
things. Yeah, the
Mhm.
consequences is like, I'd rather know what some of those consequences might be and prepare for them and have support for them than just to walk in, say my Western thing, have it go terribly wrong. And now I've protected myself, but I've also hurt myself. I've helped myself, and I've also disconnected myself from layers and layers of support. So, is there another way? Is there a hybrid way? And no two children of immigrants are going to navigate it in the exact same way, because the context is always going to be different. But that's where bringing in the nuance and particularly having lived experience can sometimes help us ask some of those questions and get creative to pair with someone around these things.
Can you give me like a practical example of what this might look like? I mean, we have Christmas coming up too. So like let's say like someone always gets invited to their like aunt's Christmas party and it lasts for 7 hours and after they're like super drained. Like what would a practical like obviously we know what the Western version is like that's like all over social media. Like you said, explicitly saying, well, I can't da 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 or whatever. But what would it look like in a different way? Like even a few different scenarios of like if you were working with a client and they had this thing that they wanted to work with.
Yeah. So it might be as simple as, I mean, I'm going to give a ton of different examples so that people can kind of see what I mean by this
Yeah.
creative and expansive mindset. It might be recognizing, okay, for me, it's once a year. I know it's 7 hours. So instead of thinking this is a 1 hour thing, I'm going to admit and accept that it's 7 hours. So what do I need to do to plan for that? What do I need to take off my schedule? How do I resource myself before that? How do I bring someone along so I can have them as my emotional support person? How do I structure my next day so that I can rest? So it's like a pure acceptance model of like walking in, not expecting that it's going to be a Western 1 hour event, that this is a 7 hour thing, and really being able to lean into it. Are there any benefits that I get from being able to accept? Do I actually enjoy some of what's happening? Um, and to maybe decide how I'm going to attend, the before, the after, and the during. Are there people, like I said, the emotional support person? Are there people that are safer for me? People that drain
Mhm.
my energy less. For me, it was always the kids. It's like, let me just find the freaking kids and play with the kids and get away from the parents and the politics and the questions I don't want to answer. So it was a lot of like finding kids and then going into that kids' room, under tables, in the corners with the kids. It was like, if I can do that, that for me is a lot easier of a party, because it's much more play and you're kind of engaging at that level and disconnecting from what I found to be a lot more burdensome. So this would be like a pure acceptance, and then really devising a how. Like if you're going on a 7 mile hike, there are ways to kind of think about how to make the hike 3 miles, or there are ways to say, I'm going to go on the 7 mile hike. Where do I need to take a stop? What do I need to take in my backpack? Who am I bringing along with me? What's my roadmap? Right. I've given the guidance for many, like find the bathrooms, because this is your place. The bathrooms and the kitchen, it's like
Yeah,
bathrooms
bathroom
where
so
you can
real.
go, have a moment, splash water, change the temperature of your body, look at yourself in the mirror, give yourself a little pep talk, give yourself a high five. Um, and then you've got the kitchen where you can get maybe involved in a task at hand. And that's kind of a nice way. I mean, again, this is maybe a little bit more gendered, because I think women in the kitchen is a lot easier than maybe men in the kitchen, depending on what the traditional kind of setup looks like. But for me, I could always get the kids and I could always get lost in a task. Let me put the food into Tupperware containers that everybody's taking home. Let me help set the table. So this gives me kind of a task. It's rhythmic. I get to just be grounded in something that's really physical and maybe away from the intensity of being in the hot seat and having people ask me when I'm getting married, what I'm doing for this, and when am I having kids, blah, 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 blah. So I'm just in this place where I'm maybe more focused on the thing at hand. So that's one pure example of if I accept and the benefit for me of seeing all these family members being within the fold, it's something I'm okay with, but it's hard on me, then I can plan just like accepting that height. Let's say you don't want to do the 7 hours. So what are some culturally validated, quote unquote, excuses for getting out? Schoolwork, maybe resting your physical body. So you say, tomorrow I'm starting work at 6 a.m. So I need to sleep. Oh, yes, honey, please sleep. Can I also take some food with me? Oh, yes, yes. Now your family is supporting you in this other task that they also are a part of, because a lot of collectivistic cultures and immigrant families see the children's success as their own success. So how many aunts have given me money, cooked for me, asked about my studies, given me a tip for a tea to drink to boost my immunity because I was studying and they saw me excelling in my academic pursuits as part of this collectivistic victory. And
Mm,
so can you use an excuse that would not be, my social battery is drained and I need to leave at 5, but you kind of say, yes, I wish I could stay. And I've got this early morning, I'm studying for this test. Could I this? Do you have a recipe for a tea I could drink? I'm struggling with my sleep. What things do you do now? You're actually using all of your cultural tools to focus on the body, health and wellness, taking care of your body, attending to the academic studies and things those are all really much more effective ways of saying no, for
mm,
example, than just prioritizing your own well-being. Now I've even pulled the aunties in,
right.
supporting me, giving me Tupperwares of food, giving me those little like my grandma would constantly give me like bags of herbs to like stew and do this, and if you this and if you that. And that was a way that I was using to be able to, again, take care of myself, leave the party early, but not use an individualistic excuse that feels harmful for them or feels like I'm basically saying, I want to cut this community, right? You're not
Mhm.
important to me versus you are important to me. These are some ways I might be able to get around that. And so this is kind of the continuum of what I mean. You can totally accept it and we can help you plan for how you might attend. Or you can say, I'd like to maybe leave early, or maybe it's that I'd like to get there halfway. So maybe work is an excuse and you get there halfway. And what you do is instead you go days earlier to help that aunt set up the party. That for you is a lot easier. Like, oh my gosh, without 100 people there, I'm going to
Mm,
ask my aunt, do an errand for her, do something beforehand that invests in this collective all hands on deck. So I'm not seen as someone that is disconnecting from the community. I'm just connecting to it in a way that I'm in charge of, that works for my mental health. That's maybe a lower barrier to entry. And then I'm joining the party a little bit later using an excuse that is not threatening to the fold at all. And so
I
now
mean,
I figured it all out.
even like without the context of collectivism, I just feel like what you're describing is a lot more harmonious, no matter your cultural background. And it's a lot less friction because the thing with boundaries is like, I think people don't understand like boundaries cause ruptures. And so what you're describing is just so much more gentle.
Yeah. And I think that, again, when you care about that gentleness because you care about continuing in the community, that's really different than maybe gentleness is far less important than being authentic to your needs. And in another context where the other person also only cares about their own
Can
needs
you
or
say
that,
that again? Sorry.
yeah, no problem. It's like I think that when you're talking about gentleness, that might not be a goal for a lot of people, right? If you're operating with somebody else that individualism reigns supreme, then you saying this is what I need, that might be fine for this other person who's like, oh, and this is what I need. Like
Mm,
that's maybe gentleness is not the goal here. And maybe it won't cause as much friction because you saying, hey, I've got an early morning, I will have to leave at 7 p.m. The other person's like, I understand. And then the next event, they're like, hey, I can't come. My social battery is drained. That that can be really okay in a certain context. And when two people really are coming from the same framework, where it causes unnecessary clash. I will point out boundaries are sometimes necessary for relationships. And
Mhm.
yet they can cause a clash unnecessarily when people are just operating from very different cultural contexts. And so this is ways to not allow a difference in cultural context to create unnecessary clash for the person that is deeming a certain boundary to be important to them.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. I have one last question
Sure.
before we wrap up. I feel like I could keep asking questions for another hour, but um okay, so in one reel that you have, you say that you'd win a gold medal in going to therapy, but are also critical of the mental health field. So can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, this is the purest example of both and thinking. You can both be really proud of going to therapy as a way to break a cycle. The cycles of silence, the cycles of shame, the cycles of normalization of abuse, the cycles of dismissing and denying your feelings. Going to therapy as a child of immigrants, where there are so many external barriers and so many internalized stigmas around mental health, is an incredibly courageous step. And at the same time, just because you are advocating for that step as an option, advocating for that step as one possible avenue for healing, for support, doesn't mean that you can't also be critical of the ways in which we learn Western psychology, critical of the ways we completely devalue other ways of being and say this is the one way to be healthy, ways that the field is inherently racist and misogynistic in its roots, in its histories, and we never address those things, ways that we can be critical about the ways that Western therapy upholds systems of oppression. And so you can think of both. Do I think therapy is this place that you can be incredibly courageous in breaking cycles? Yes. And do I think that the field of therapy needs to be completely redone, revamped, redesigned, and, you know, really critically looked at so that we can undo some of the harmful pieces of it? Also, yes. And these things are not at odds with one another. I deeply love the mental health field, and I deeply think that the mental health field could do better. And that's the line I am able to hold at the same exact time. Same thing with being an American. I really, I'm going to be careful here, but it's like there's so many positives that I've experienced living in America, and so many privileges and securities and experiences and opportunities that I've been granted. And there is such deep sadness, grief, and rage at the ways in which America, white supremacy, Western imperialism, and colonization have shaped the trajectory of my people and other people. And never before have we seen that, even more than this moment when there are poly crises that we are actively supporting. So can I feel patriotic and very critical of America at the same exact time? Yes. This is also for children of immigrants. I can love my family, and I can be so angry at the way that my family continued cycles of violence and addiction and hurt me and neglected me. And I can
Mhm.
love my parents and I can be critical of the things they didn't do. I can love my parents and I can be angry at them. I can love my parents and recognize the ways that I've got to do differently for my kids. Like these are not things that are against one another. Love does not mean complete agreement with everything that happened. Love means being clear and seeing things clearly. And I can love certain things while not being complicit in the other things or not trying to shake up certain things that I think are really harmful. And so this is the both and framework that I think we have to
Mhm.
use as children of immigrants, but really as people. I think this kind of culturally informed, expansive, inclusive way of thinking is actually going to be beneficial for everybody, to really hold the spaciousness of these things and realize they don't have to be, either or. They're things that we can hold ambivalently. And sometimes we feel one side more than the other. And can we make space for both of these experiences to live side by side? And so I will continue to say I love therapy and I kind of hate therapy and I think therapy could do better. Like both of those things are true at the same exact time.
Yeah. No notes. Perfect.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I mean that reminds me of when I was in therapy and I was explaining something about my family and I said something da 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 positive, but, and then it was something negative, and my therapist was like, you can use the word and instead of but, and that puts them on equal ground. Because with but, it sounds like you're discarding, like, I love being an American, but blah blah blah. You're discarding I love being an American. And with and it's like, yeah, this, but I feel like when you come from the space of cultural awareness, you, at least for me, I had it really ingrained in me, nothing is better or worse, it's all just different and it all has value. And so I think like that space in particular is particularly nuanced, and you particularly become aware that every single thing in life has some nice things and some not so nice things. So I feel like it's just this capacity to hold both.
Yeah, and
Nice.
it's respecting that you get to make a choice around which pieces you are okay holding and where you want to be on that continuum. And it's really respecting that this person can make that decision and be spacious enough to hold the wonderful parts of it and the difficult parts of it. So it's respectful and it's inherently strength based and really honoring of the person's ability to do this rather than I've got to tell you exactly what health is. And then once you get to this place, it's like a full destination, 100% is like, that's just not realistic to life either. So this is an approach that is much more respectful of individual autonomy as well as that person's decision to be much more in the fold. So individual autonomy could look like I'm much more going to be in a community place. And I don't have to look at that as less than or me being a people pleaser. That can be an active choice. That can be an empowering choice for some. And I think that, yeah, regardless of where you live physically, it's kind of where do you live emotionally and metaphorically? There's no one right way of being. And can we find ways that feel like they work for us? Well, in order to do that, we have to be given more options than sometimes are presented to us.
Mm-hmm. And before we wrap up, I know you just had a launch, but if people want to work with you, or where can they find you? And do you have any current offerings that you're promoting right now?
Yeah, I've got a program called the Culture and Connection Program. It's my signature one-on-one coaching program, and I've done it with women across the world for the last 2 years, and that's an evergreen offer. So I will always offer that. It's month long, and us going through this kind of live coaching course that I've developed with 4 different modules where we start at the intergenerational piece, look at the childhood piece, delve into your relationship with yourself, and then identify your values and how to be in relationship with others. So it's really a guidebook for the how to of everything we've discussed here. I just did launch the group version of it. I ran it in March. I'm running it now in October. Probably won't run it again until next year, but you can get on a wait list for that and be the first to know when it opens up again. I've got a boundary course under 50 bucks USD online. We'll tell you all the framework that I talked about and then give you all the specific tools and practical choices that you've got for how to boundary set within a collectivistic culture that's available via app and desktop, and you have access to it forever. And then my Instagram at Pauline the Psychologist. It's the space that I really, it is the free ongoing resource, right? Just to hear these things discussed, just so validating. And I get so many comments from people that say, oh my gosh, this is an approach that I knew in my bones, but I've really never heard a psychologist speak from this place and validate this place or give me those choices or just see me in my experiences and the uniqueness of those challenges we talked about in question one. And so that is a great place to go and find out about all my various other offerings. And then the last thing is that I'm working on developing a CEU course, a continuing education course for therapists. So if you are a therapist and you've been trained in Western psychology, you know it doesn't fit. Maybe you're a child of immigrants. I have a lot of followers that are other mental health practitioners. And if you want to learn a little bit about this, I'm trying to take 14 years of doing this and like, okay, what do I think are the frameworks and how would I help someone to develop their own way of using their own lived experience to help children of immigrants? I'm working on a course for that, and I'm hoping that that will come out sometime early next year. So if you want to get on the wait list for that, you can also see that on my Instagram as well in terms of getting to be the first to know about when that launches, because I do think we need much more training in this, especially if even as a child of immigrants, when you've got training in the Western context, it can be hard to know, wait, how do I adapt those theories? What might I do with the client? So I'm hoping to create this as a really practical resource for those that want to learn how to work with the children of immigrants.
That sounds very cool.
Yeah, that's
Well,
all
thank
of
you for
about
joining
all
me.
that. Yeah, absolutely. I'm so, so glad that I was here. Your questions, as I was even reading through them when you sent them to me, I was like, these are just so insightful and really speaking to the experience of so many people that are finding themselves like just opening their eyes to, wait a second, there's another way. And whoa, there are other options. So I'm hoping that as listeners listen to this, they had more questions and more ahas and more things they want to learn about. That's what I hope to leave people with, is that, oh my gosh, there's a lot more out here and I've got to look more and ask more and figure out more. And that can be overwhelming, but I hope that it's empowering to know it's not just the one way that we've been taught, and to begin to open people's eyes up to the expansiveness of this, because that's when possibility flourishes. Like, how else could we do this dance of mental health and culture? How else can we do this dance of self and other? And I hope that you begin to ask yourself those questions just by listening to today's podcast.